Linux Luddites, episode 78, the 16th of May, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
And I'm Paddy. And whilst it's only Joe and me for the news and feedback this time around, Jesse will be joining us later to give us his first impressions of Antergos. And also as the three of us sit down to chat with Ryan Sipes about how Mycroft is coming along. And as we try to bottom out just how open that project will eventually be. So with all that to come, should we just crack on with the news?
Yeah, let's do it. Well, let's start the news with the incredibly exciting announcement of the Journal of Open Source Software, which I think is something to do with academic papers. I don't know. I read this a few times, Paddy, and it went over my head, I'm afraid. No, well, not really. It's the bottom line is that if you want to be able to cite your work in a proper academic paper and your work is writing software, then it's pretty difficult at the moment, and there are a few academic journals that you can submit a paper to, whereas now we're going to have the Journal of Open Source Software, which is kind of specifically designed for this. And I don't really see why you would need to have an academic journal to cite, but I suppose some people do.
I think it's about career progression, really, isn't it? And in the academic field, it's just expected that you will be able to cite from various sources, and that's how you prove that you've provided some worth. But
surely just the software itself is proof enough, isn't it?
In our world it is, yeah, but obviously not in academia. And I guess the sort of project they're thinking about including in that is the one I'm going to talk about now. Well, maybe not on this scale, but something along these lines anyway. Google have open sourced their TensorFlow-based dependency parsing library, which is called SyntaxNet. And SyntaxNet is a library for training and running syntactic dependency parsing models for use in natural language processing.
And it's got a really great name, hasn't it? Yeah. Parsy McParseface.
Yes, that's a model they're including that's been pre-trained in the English language, which, as you suggest, is an obvious pun on the Boaty McBoatface, which we've recently seen everywhere on the internet and had our hopes and dreams crushed by the evil UK government. But anyway, Parsy McParseface, this English language processing model, achieves about 94% accuracy at around 600 words per second. I was curious about this, so I did a little bit of digging. And by way of comparison, a fairly well-known Spacey system runs about 25 times faster, but achieves around 92.4% accuracy. And whilst that sounds like a clear win for Spacey, Matthew Honeyball, who's the CTO at Spacey, has said, quote, "The extra accuracy might not sound like much, but for applications, it's likely to be pretty significant."
So how much of this is actually going to be open source then? That's the question I've got, because surely this stuff is really keenly guarded intellectual property.
Well, I had a look at the license files I could find and also the headers in the syntax.net software that's up on GitHub. And it appears to be Apache, and it looks as if it's all open, to be honest. And the other thing that struck me really about it was that, like Spacey itself, SyntaxNet will happily run on a moderately powerful desktop PC. So you can pull down the repo and give it a whirl yourself.
All right, so you don't need a big, beefy server to run it then?
No, that'd been my assumption as well. And I wish this news had come out before we interviewed Ryan, because I'd really like to have talked to him about it. But sadly, we pre-recorded that interview.
Yeah, because Mycroft could really benefit from something like this, I would have thought.
Yeah, I can remember when we spoke to Ryan, we sort of let it go past us when he said about looking at solutions from IBM and Google, but we didn't really delve further into it. And I guess that was our ignorance at the time. I found a little bit more about this ever since, because I was trying to actually work out how Spacey and SyntaxNet all fitted together and all this natural language processing stuff, and ended up reading an awful lot of stories about it. And it became quite apparent that none of the journalists understood it either, because they just quoted from the original blog post from Google. But yeah, it's been an interesting few days trying to find out how all this stuff works.
It does seem to be the future, doesn't it? I mean, I know that we've been reasonably skeptical about it, but a lot of time and effort and money has been invested into this stuff. So you would have thought that can't be for nothing.
Yeah, I've got to say, I'm still skeptical about voice input, but actual language processing seems to have an awful lot of applications out there.
Well, let's move on to the bad news about Subsonic then, and that's going closed source. So Subsonic, what is that, I hear you ask? Well, I didn't know either, so I had to read about it. Well, it turns out that it is pretty much like Plex. So it's server software that you run somewhere, either on your local network or out on the internet somewhere, and upload all of your music to that, and indeed other media files. It seems that it started with music and audio, but it's kind of progressed into video and stuff like Plex. And then you can stream that to any device you want, be it a desktop or through mobile apps and stuff. So it seems like a pretty useful bit of software, and I'm surprised I hadn't heard of it before it went proprietary. And unfortunately, that's what's happened.
Have they explained why they've made this decision? Is it something down to codecs or some other reason?
I think it is about codecs, yeah. The main reason for this change is that the source contains some software license codes I've purchased, and that shouldn't be used by forked projects, says the developer, whose name I'm afraid I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce. It's a Norwegian guy. So there must have been a way to obfuscate that in the source code, wouldn't there? It seems like a bit of a flimsy excuse to me.
Yeah, licensing of codecs is a bit of a thorny issue. I mean, it was only this morning I saw in the news that Visor, which is a reasonably popular Android mirroring application, so you can actually see your phone and control your phone from your desktop, and it was written by Kush, who's a well-known Android developer. It had actually been pulled from the Play Store, apparently because it was containing some H.264 codecs, and they were asking for 20 cents a download, and he wasn't prepared to start charging for it.
Well, this is a real shame, though, because people often talk about Plex, and there's Servio as well. And this could have been something I could recommend to people, but I'm certainly not going to recommend it now it's gone proprietary.
Well, let's move on from one bit of bad news to yet another. Well, sort of. We're going to talk about image magic and some of the bugs that have come to light recently. And in a way, this was actually quite good news, I thought, because they had a logo and they had a tagline and a name and everything for all this slew of bugs. It's Image Tragic.
Yeah, it's got a catchy name. And I don't know, how widespread is this? It's not something that you would necessarily know you were using, is it? Because it's used by a lot of websites in the back end to process images that you've uploaded, to do cropping and all that kind of stuff. So I would imagine there are a lot of websites using this and people using it without realizing.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, anything from avatars on web forums to producing thumbnails for your actual website is likely to be being run by Image Magic behind the scenes. They have actually said they came up with this logo and name and what have you because they tried to flag up the vulnerability previously and no one taken any notice, which is, I don't know. I mean, we've talked about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing having the actual press associated with these publicity sort of seeking bug pages. But in this case, it seems to have been necessary to actually get the word out there. And there's a whole slew, as I said, of bugs here that have been found, and they are quite bad. I mean, we're talking about things that will allow actual command injection fairly simply, sort of along the lines that we see with SQL injection, where it's just adding the actual commands after a semicolon or something like that. So if you're running an unpatched version of ImageMagick, you're potentially opening up your whole server to remote code execution.
So where are we with fixes with this? I read an article from not that long ago where it said that we're kind of incomplete at this stage.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Fortunately, the exploit code, well, fortunately, it's not out in the wild. Well, it is. The people who flagged up the vulnerabilities say it's actively being exploited. Unfortunately, those of us who are wanting to patch our systems haven't got access to that exploit code yet, so we can't see exactly how it's going on. But it is very straightforward from the account they've given, and I would hope that people do keep on top of their patching.
Right. Very quick question. Is WordPress affected by this?
Not directly, no. It doesn't use it.
Okay, good.
In the default state, it doesn't use it.
But presumably there's some plugins that will use it. Right. Okay. I'm hoping that none of my plugins do on my site, and I'm sure that you're on top of this.
Yes.
Good to know.
Okay.
Well, hopefully this sort of thing can be avoided in the future with SourceClear Open, which is a free service from SourceClear, which basically tracks security bugs in various libraries and pieces of software that your project will depend on. And in theory, allows you to make much more secure applications, and all for free. So that seems pretty decent of them. I suppose they're trying to get you to use their free service and then upgrade to their enterprise stuff. So fair play to them.
Yeah, it sounds like a perfectly reasonable deal to me. We talked about SourceClear in the past and some of their static analysis, and I'm just very pleased to see this happening, and hopefully people take advantage of it.
Well, it is powered by data science, so it's got to be good.
Oh, Lord. Should we move on rapidly?
Yeah.
Okay. We spent a lot of time talking about ad blocking on the show and advertising as an industry. And the reason for that, obviously, is that an awful lot of the internet is actually funded simply and purely from advertising. Now, AdBlock Plus guys have come out and said they've now got 100 million active users. And they've also announced an initiative called Flatter Plus, which obviously is a teaming up job with Flatter between AdBlock Plus and Flatter guys. And this is aiming to provide a micropayment service for online content providers.
Aiming is the key word there, I think. It's a little bit like the Brave browser idea, only much less dubious, in that it will kind of automatically track which sites you're visiting and for how long, and whether you scroll down the page and how long you looked at it, that sort of thing. And then spread out the money that you have decided that you will give per month to the various content creators. So it sounds all well and good in theory. It sounds like quite a democratic way of giving money to various people. But to be negative as usual, it depends on people giving money in the first place. And Flatter exists on this same principle, only you manually pay people. So you give them, say, £10 or £20 a month, and then you click on various people's Flatter buttons to say that you like the content that they're producing. And then at the end of the month, it divides the £10 or £20 by the number of clicks that you've done. Whereas this is an automated version of that. Now, I said it tracks you, so there are some privacy concerns, but I think they could probably, well, I don't know, maybe they could get around that. But that's not my main concern with it. My main concern is that people expect things to be free. And we keep coming back to that problem that people expect content for free, but they also expect not to see adverts. And so someone's got to pay for this stuff. And it ends up being, if we go to a model like this, I think it's going to end up being a tiny minority of people who will do it.
I think you're right. Big question, obviously, is whether that tiny minority, if it's a tiny minority out of the billion plus users, say, using mobile phones, whether it's enough to sustain everybody or not is another matter. Apparently, a beta of this service is going to start rolling out early in the summer. The first stable release is penciled in for the end of the year. And the penny had never dropped for me, because although I've spoken to Linus before, who's one of the developers at Flatter, I've never really tied two and two together and realised that Peter Sunday is the other guy involved, who actually was one of the founders of the Pirate Bay.
Yeah, I'd never realised that either. And people talk about how the Pirate Bay disrupted media, which I think is disrupted if you use Stuart Language's version of it, which I probably can't say on this show. But Flatter, in our experience, is it fair to say, Paddy, has been a little bit chaotic and disorganized behind the scenes?
Yeah, certainly going through growing pains. I mean, they swapped out their entire platform sort of from the middle of last year. It's still an ongoing effort, to be honest. But it's just the adoption hasn't been great. And how much of that is down to the fact that they denominate everything in euros? I suspect that's probably quite a large factor, to be honest, with most of the web population thinking, at least, that the United States rules the world.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the kind of de facto standard, isn't it? That everything is in dollars. Even if you're in a different country, everyone can work with dollars. It's like English is the standard language and dollars, US dollars, are the standard currency of the web. So I'm surprised that, yeah, they've done it. I mean, presumably must be for tax reasons or whatever, because it's based in Europe. But maybe if they could offer it in dollars as well, that might help. And I think that pulling things like PayPal don't help. I know that PayPal has got large fees and a lot of people have issues with them. But PayPal is still the standard way to send money around on the internet, isn't it? And when they pulled that from Platter, that was a big step backwards in terms of functionality, as far as I'm concerned. But maybe teaming up with AdBlock Plus, who are very well known. AdBlock Plus, I'm still using it, even though all the cool kids have moved on to that other one that you use.
uBlock Origin.
Yeah, that's the one. I'm too lazy to change. It's still doing the job for me. So I'm sure there are a lot of other people, 100 million active users, they claim. So you wouldn't need that many of them to make this a success, I don't think. But I don't know, I'm not confident. Surprise, surprise. But let's move on and talk about something completely different, and that is Debian. And the i386 architecture now requires a 686 class processor. So Debian is the universal operating system. It's compiled for all sorts of different architectures. It works on almost anything. To get a desktop up, you need something of a fairly decent processor, but certainly if you just want to run it headless or run a server, then it'll work on almost anything. But now you need a 686 class processor as a minimum. So it has cut out quite a lot of very, very old processors, which are surely obsolete anyway. I don't know. I can see why they've done it, but at the same time, it's supposed to be the universal operating system, isn't it? But how many people are using these ancient processors?
Yeah, I can see why they've done it as well. And the thing that struck me about the story was it doesn't appear to have been a choice really on their part. It's because GCC has stopped supporting the microcode architecture, the P5 microcode architecture, as far as I can tell, and that's why this change has occurred.
And I suppose they don't have the resources to look after GCC themselves for such a minority group of processors, so maybe it's just time to move on from them.
Yeah, change is inevitable. And if that holds true for Debian, it certainly does for Linux Mint. And the main reason a lot of people are first attracted to Mint is you install it and it works out of the box. All of it works. You can play your media quite happily. And Clem's made the decision that he's going to start dropping all the codecs from their images. They never were included in OEM images, as far as I can remember, because of the legal aspects. But now he's decided to drop them from all images, just to make the build process simpler. I'm not totally convinced that's going to be a winning strategy.
It seems to be turning, doesn't it? The tide seems to be turning for Linux Mint. First, it was the security with their website, and then people started to really scrutinize the code quality and some of the decisions they've made with forking apps and calling them things that they shouldn't have because there was existing software of that name. And now this. And you're right, Paddy, that was a big factor for a lot of people. Certainly when Mint appeared. I mean, when Mint first appeared, that's all it was, Ubuntu with codecs and a green theme. But then it's evolved slowly over time to be its own standalone project, I think. And especially with Cinnamon, I mean, that was a homegrown desktop environment, which I happen to really like. I think it's a little bit bloated, but if you've got the power to run it, it's still really, really nice. And now for them to drop the codecs for understandable reasons. I mean, I've heard people saying that they shouldn't have really been shipping those codecs in the first place. That's why very few professional distributions actually do that. It seems to only be the sort of, one fellow in his garage type distros that include the codecs for these legal reasons, because the likes of Ubuntu and Fedora don't want to face the legal ramifications of that, which is surprising from Ubuntu, given all this ZFS stuff. Ha ha ha. But now Mint are in this same position where they're going to be shipping what's essentially the same situation as Ubuntu, where, you can tick the box in the installer and it'll install them, or you can go through the menu and it'll make it really easy to do that. And I hope and trust that they will make it very easy to install the codecs, but just by default, they won't be there. And so it's only a minor difference, but I think it is enough to put people off. And I totally understand why. If they are having to have all of these different ISOs and having to do all the QA testing and all that on them, to have fewer of those makes their job much easier. But I do think it's a bit of a dodgy decision. I think if they could possibly spare the effort required to do that, then they should do it. So maybe there is more to it than that, because they've been testing all these different ISOs for all of this time. And maybe, I know they got the new corporate sponsor involved, didn't they? That security company, I've forgotten the name now.
I don't know about this.
Oh, you didn't know about it? Oh, you should be listening more closely to Mintcast, where you get all the Mint news. Yeah, it's a security company who helped them out during the website hack business is now sponsoring them. And maybe they have advised them that this codec thing is, if you're going to be getting bigger and bigger and getting more money coming in, you probably should not be shipping these codecs by default, because it's risking legal problems in quite a lot of countries.
I just assumed it's because they're spreading themselves a bit too thin. Because, as you say, they're trying to rewrite a load of basic X apps as well as developing several desktops. And it just seemed like low-hanging fruit to actually inconvenience the consumer a little bit here and favour the developers. Maybe
it is that straightforward, and maybe I'm trying to look too deeply into this here. But I had always been surprised that they'd got away with it, and I'd always thought it was because they're quite minority. And I don't believe that the DistroWatch ranking has much relation to the actual number of users. I think that Mint is very popular and does have a lot of users, but I think Ubuntu has far more. And certainly if you count all the flavors as well.
Yeah, we need the DistroWatch rankings there, or else Mr. Lundu couldn't have anything to put in his talks.
I don't know, I've never watched them. Genuinely haven't. The first one of the Linux sucks things was just too bad quality audio, so I thought, no, not watching that anymore.
All right, well, enough discussion on other podcasters. What else is happening over at Mint? I understand they're going their own way on Mate as well.
Yes, my understanding is that everybody else, all the other distros who are using Mate and up-to-date versions of Mate, are building it against GTK 3. But for reasons which are not hugely clear to me, Clem has decided that Linux Mint Mate Edition will be built against GTK 2 for this 18 release, which is going to be around for 2 years with the point releases, which effectively means that GTK 2 can't die in terms of Mate, and it's going to have to be supported either by the Mate team or independently by Clem and the Linux Mint team. So I can kind of see why he's doing it, for stability, and that is where Linux Mint has positioned itself now. It's positioned itself kind of where we are as a show, and, kind of along with our ethos that we like stability, we don't like change for its own sake. And now with the long-term support strategy, you'll get this 18 release, and then you'll get the 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3, and nothing much will change. You'll get a few effectively backported fixes and improvements to Cinnamon and Mate and some of the Linux Mint applications, and hopefully things like LibreOffice as well. But you won't get huge changes happening. And so that's kind of the strategy. That's where they've put themselves now. And so they do stand alone apart from things like Ubuntu. And Ubuntu Mate is the prime example here, because Ubuntu Mate and Linux Mint Mate, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is that you get the LTS, but with some newer stuff as well down the line. And so I can see why they've adopted this position of wanting just long-term stability. They know GTK2 works. GTK3 is a little bit out there, even though it's not really. I mean, it's where everyone is going. But right now, GTK2 is working fine for them. So they're thinking, well, why bother changing it? If it's not broken, don't fix it, sort of thing.
Yeah, it seems reasonable.
Well, it does seem reasonable, but if everyone else is moving to GTK3, then maybe you should make the effort to do that and try and make that the new stable. But either way, it's going to make Mint Mate stand out even more from Ubuntu Mate. And I suppose it will divide the audience, won't it? Some people want the newer stuff. Some people are happy with the older stuff. And I suppose it's staying true to where it's found itself now, which is strange because if you think about it, Mint early on was, it felt like a new and fresher version of Ubuntu. I mean, even the name Mint is minty fresh. Whereas now they've kind of become this sort of almost stick in the mud Luddite distro, which is strange evolution, but given its popularity, and I played it down a bit, but I think it is still hugely popular. Clearly, there are a lot of people who want that stability and are of the same mindset that we are, and don't necessarily want all the new shiny Arch stuff. So fair play to him. Let's see what happens with it.
Yeah, it's a shame Jesse's not here, because I've never really understood the appeal of Mint, to be honest. I know in the past he's defended it and said they provide lots of extra value with the various applications, or applets, I guess they would be, because they're not full-blown things, for creating USB sticks and what have you.
Yeah.
I've just never got that, to be honest. It's never seemed enough over and above what Ubuntu provide themselves to actually warrant a specific distro itself.
I'm somewhat split on it. I think Cinnamon is really nice. But then again, you can kind of get most of the features from that with XFC and the Whisker menu anyway. And I suppose it comes down to default theming, default application choices, and whether or not you're into that. I mean, I can see the use for it for some people, but I think people like you, it's just not aimed at you, is it? You like to build your system up. You are quite into this idea of the Ubuntu minimal installation, aren't you?
Yeah.
Whereas for people who don't want to go to that effort and will just use whatever is made default for them, and I think there are a lot of people who want that, they just want something that all works together nicely out of the box. I can see them wanting to use Linux Mint. So I think that you're just not the audience is the bottom line here.
Well, obviously, because of the lineage, we mentioned Ubuntu several times there. What have they been up to?
Well, they have been making plans to change how scopes work on Ubuntu Touch. Scopes being the alternative to apps, I suppose, a content aggregation system, I think they would call it, where instead of a home screen with apps, you get a home screen that's got sort of stuff on it.
Several home screens with stuff on that you spend forever scrolling across to get to the one you want.
I'll take it you're not much of a fan then. Well, I know you're not much of a fan because we reviewed it, didn't we?
Yeah, we did, yeah.
And so what they're going to do is they're going to try and sort of tidy this up a bit. They're going to make it inside a browser window with tabs. So instead of swiping endlessly, you kind of got clear tabs to look at it on, which I suppose fits in with how they do everything as web apps. And they've made some other changes, or they're going to be making some other changes, which I suppose make it a bit better. But I think the whole fundamental idea is something that doesn't appeal to me in the first place, and I don't think is an adequate replacement for lack of apps. I've said it many times. You can't cover up the fact that no one is developing apps for your platform by saying, oh, we don't need apps, we've got scopes, they're better, because they're just not, are they? I could see maybe, I mean, it's like widgets, isn't it? It's pretty much like having an Android phone, but with a load of pre-installed widgets to get you stuff like weather and local restaurants and music and YouTube and stuff, which you could set up manually if you wanted, or if Ubuntu and Canonical were really dead set on this, they could write some widgets for Android quite easily and make themselves their own launcher, the Ubuntu launcher or whatever. And so I don't think that it's doing anything that you can't do with Android. I just think it's doing something that isn't being done already for Android. And then that begs the question as to why is it not being done for Android? And my answer would be because nobody wants it. But if you do want it, it looks like this is an improvement to it. And maybe it'll be enough to convince some other people. Maybe it's just because I have my Android phone with one home screen and just the app grid and stuff and no widgets or anything, or very well, I have one widget. But I have it very, very simple, whereas I see other people with widgets all over the place. So maybe it appeals to some people. And I think having done this redesign of it, I think that is going to make it better than it was.
Yeah, I'm not entirely convinced. I mean, like you, I don't use any widgets whatsoever on my phone. But the thing that's really struck me about this redesign is I can see why they did it and what they're trying to get away from. And it's what we've criticised before, the endless swiping. But don't you think the tabs look very small as target areas for your finger? And also the fact you can close them. I mean, how do you reopen them again? I mean, it just doesn't seem to be an intuitive experience to me.
Well, I'll have to reserve judgment until I've actually tried it out on the Nexus 7 or the Nexus 4. But I can see your issue with it. It does seem to be more sort of desktop-based with tabs with little close buttons on them. But if they can find a way to make that more touch-friendly, then it does seem neater to me.
Well, they're clearly not running it past Mark either, because the close buttons are on the right rather than the left.
Oh, yeah, they're in the right place. Ah.
Spooky, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm sure he'll change that when he sees it.
But you're right, we ought to reserve judgment until we've actually tried it, but it does look like a very quick fix to me.
Do we know when we're actually going to be able to try this out then?
I believe it's OTA 11, or possibly after Unity 8's been pushed out, so 2037, 38?
Yeah, 2050. Yeah, well, we'll see. When it does come out, we'll have a good look at it. I think it'll be a good excuse to have another look at Ubuntu Touch, and that always seems to be a ratings winner. So, yeah, let's reserve judgment for now.
Well, sticking with mobile, and let's talk about Android a little bit. And the FTC and the FCC are starting a joint investigation into how Android security updates and fixes are rolled out or not. And they've approached both hardware manufacturers and the carriers to ask a series of questions. Many of these seem eminently reasonable to me. The questions include such things as, what's the period of time that a specific device model will be supported for security updates, the company's processes for developing security updates to address vulnerabilities. And I think this is something we don't often consider. We ought to. For those instances where a needed security update for a vulnerability wasn't rolled out to certain devices, if the owners of those devices were actually notified.
Well, I don't think they ever have been. When a company that makes phones abandons it, they're not going to make the effort to tell their customers, oh, by the way, there's this huge security issue and we're not fixing it. And we've talked about this so many times, haven't we, that you can go and buy phones that are got vulnerabilities out of the box that are never going to be patched. And I'm not generally one for government interference, but this sounds like, please, at last, government, get involved, interfere, make them do something about this. It's such a terrible situation where you can buy a phone and never get security updates for it, and not even have, in a lot of cases, an unlocked bootloader so you can learn about this stuff yourself and install CyanogenMod and get updates that way. A lot of them are just totally locked down appliances that are just vulnerable and just totally useless.
Yeah, I think if they do go down the route of forcing companies to notify users that they won't be receiving important updates going forwards, or ever in fact, it probably will change how companies approach the whole process. Well,
hopefully, yeah. I suppose that's probably the best way to go about it, rather than forcing them to put out the updates. That's probably untenable, but forcing them to at least notify people seems a little bit more doable. And yeah, maybe people will start to wake up and realize, well, hang on, this phone coming from this manufacturer isn't giving me updates, but a little bit of research tells me that a Nexus device will give me updates. Maybe I should buy that next time, or, get that on my next contract. Hopefully the EU will follow suit after this and, have that here as well, because it's not limited to the US by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, but their laws won't apply to us going forwards, will they?
We will after I vote to stay in.
Well, we'll cancel each other out then.
Always with the politics. Right, let's move on to talk about the Remix Mini, speaking of Android. So we reviewed the Remix Mini what feels like a long time ago, and that is a little Android machine which is basically a desktop, and it's got the USB ports, HDMI, Ethernet, that sort of thing, and you plug in your keyboard and mouse and you've got Android, but it's a proper desktop skin on top of it, so you can resize your windows and all that kind of thing, and have a taskbar and a clock and something of a start menu. And I've actually been using it recently to watch a bit of iPlayer and stuff. It's quite a good little media box. But this week, an update was released for it, which, to be fair, it did say was optional. And after you do that, Google stuff stops working. I was expecting Google stuff to be removed, so Google Play Store primarily, but it's still there, but you open it up and you just get a white screen and nothing happens. And so you have to go and download an APK from some dodgy site. Okay, well, it is Google Pages, but still makes me uncomfortable. And once you've installed that, it gives you back GMS, Google Mobile Services, which I didn't realize was a thing. I knew about Google Play Services, but it's something related to that anyway. And then after that, everything's working fine again. So the question is, why have they done this? Clearly not out of choice. Clearly because the dark hand of Google has reached around their neck and forced them to do it.
Oh, sure, this is just Google trying to maintain an excellent customer experience. And
well, yeah, it's an excellent experience for people who have bought the Remix Mini from Amazon. I mean, we bought it from the Kickstarter knowing that it wasn't, necessarily going to be production ready and stuff. But people who've bought it from Amazon, suddenly, if they didn't read that update, they're going to be a bit perplexed as to why they can't install any apps anymore from the Play Store. And they're probably not going to go and work out how to fix it. Although maybe that's not giving them enough credit. Maybe they will work it out. It is quite straightforward. But this, I don't know, a conspiracy theorist might say is because in Android N, they're going to bring in some of this windowing functionality. And so this is them kind of preemptively trying to kill off Remix OS, because without Google Play stuff, not many people are going to be interested, are they? I mean, I know a lot of our audience don't care about that, and they like to run CyanogenMod. Like we spoke to Phelim about that, running without Google at all. But the vast majority of people who use Android rely on Google services. So if you rip that stuff out, it becomes pretty useless to them.
Yeah, I don't think a tinfoil hat's required in the slightest. I think that seems eminently reasonable business proposition and probably what's happened.
Which is a real shame because, I mean, come on, Google. This is a minority little piece of hardware. They've sold, I would have thought hundreds of thousands, maybe tops of these things. Compared to all of the, proper Android phones and stuff, it just seems like it just makes Google look dodgy and, evil. And they're supposed to not be, are they? Although I suppose Alphabet don't care about that anymore, do they?
Well, another organisation we've frequently knocked in the past for their scant regard for the customers is Mozilla. And they've announced a new Firefox test pilot program, which apparently will allow participants to try features that are still being worked on. And as someone who's given up on the bloated corpse that is Firefox a long time ago, I really don't understand this, Joe, but I know you still use it. I mean, how is this different from the beta program? Is it just that it'll allow you to turn certain experimental features on and off at will, or what?
Well, that seems to be the case, yeah, that you've got more granular control over how experimental you want it to be. But just seems too little too late, doesn't it? It's not something I'm going to be particularly interested in. I think if you're specifically developing extensions for Firefox, then maybe this could be useful, but I don't know. It just seems to be trying to generate a bit of buzz and not really working.
Yeah, and for all the knocking we give them, though, they do still try to do a little bit of good out in the community, don't they?
Well, they try. There's the MOS, Mozilla Open Source Support project, which traditionally has given money to projects that are directly helping Mozilla and their products, whereas now they've opened applications for other free software projects that aren't necessarily tied in with what Mozilla are doing, but are kind of furthering the agenda. That's not the right word, is it? I suppose the mission of what Mozilla are trying to do with opening the web and stuff. So if you're a decent open source project, then you can maybe get some of the money. And the huge pot of money is $1.25 million, which is a lot of money until you consider how much money Mozilla have got. We often like to joke about how they've just got more money than they know what to do with. And it really is quite staggering, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we haven't got recent figures, but in 2014, they had revenue of 330 million. So that 1.25 million fund is less than 0.5% of their annual revenue.
But that was 2014 and things have moved along in the last couple of years. So maybe this is all of their revenue now, now that everyone's deserted them.
I wonder if Pale Moon are going to be applying for any funds.
Yeah, I'm sure they'd love to give them some money, wouldn't they? But I see you put a little note in here about DuckDuckGo and how they give quite a lot of money to various projects like OpenBSD and stuff like that. And that seems to be an awful lot of money, $25,000 to, what is that, about 7 or 8 projects, which for a company the size of DuckDuckGo is actually quite a lot.
Yeah, it's hard to know really because they are a private company, so we don't know what their revenue is. But it's nice to see people doing it. And for all the knocking we give these companies, it obviously buys them good publicity, but it is good news as well.
Yeah, well, we need some way to support a lot of these projects, so that seems like as good a way as any.
And let's stay on the good news front and wrap things up with a couple of good news stories from Italy. And the first one is that the city of Vicenza is replacing Windows 7 with Zorin OS. And last summer, a parent volunteer at a school in that city installed Zorin onto 40 old PCs to extend their life. And it appears that other local authority figures were impressed with how that turned out, as they've now announced their intention to replace Windows and roll Zorin out onto 700 PCs across the municipality's estate.
I'm so tempted to be negative about this. Why Zorin OS? But no, okay, it's still excellent news. 700 PCs is a lot. It's a serious number here. And this city seems to be following a trend. And I suppose if you look at all of the cities across Europe, there are an awful lot of them. But one by one, they seem to be slowly shifting to open source. And I suppose Zorin OS is a reasonable choice because it looks just like Windows, even more so than, say, Ubuntu Mate or Linux Mint. So it makes a bit more sense, but I worry whether they've got the resources to support this, because surely you do need to offer a bit of support. And so something like Canonical would make more sense, wouldn't it? So that they'd at least have the option there, or even with Red Hat, or if they started with CentOS and could have the option to get support from Red Hat. But hopefully the IT staff have got enough in-house experience to support it themselves if anything goes wrong. So let me try and stop being negative and just say, yes, this is definite win for FOSS. And hopefully this will go well and there won't be any complaints and it will spread to other cities in Italy and indeed Europe and maybe the whole world. And then we can stop spending taxpayers' money on proprietary software.
Yeah, well, if you don't want to be negative, I will a little bit. I mean, you mentioned the familiarity for Windows users there. I think that's key, and it's something that I know there are disparate opinions on within the FOSS community, but license costs are a tiny proportion of the actual costs of actually running a computer. I mean, training for users as well as the application software sits on top, obviously. But training is a vast cost involved here. And if you've got something that looks identical to Windows, and Zorin can be made to look identical to Windows out of the box using its theme switching stuff that I remember we looked at when we reviewed it, I mean, that does take a huge burden off and makes it sort of in pole position for this sort of initiative. And I know people like having different themes on their distros, and it's something we've talked about ad nauseum previously. But they've just got to get through their thick heads that if you want to appeal to Windows users, make it look like Windows.
I don't know if looking like is more important than acting like.
I think both are equally important, to be honest. And even something as simple as having like garish wallpaper, which is easily changed. We cannot say it's all easily changed. Don't. Just have a default out-of-the-box experience that is familiar and welcoming, and you'll get an awful lot further than a lot of these distros do.
Well, I'd be perfectly happy to see Zorin on machines that are paid for by me and my fellow UK taxpayers. I mean, I'd prefer something that I'd choose myself over Zorin, but it's all free software, so, fair play to them. And it's not only Vicenza who are replacing some proprietary software with free software. The Italian military reckon they're going to save between 26 and 29 million euros by migrating to LibreOffice rather than Microsoft. So again, who would have thought that the Italians would be so progressive here? It's usually you think of Spain and in recent years France and Germany, but now it seems to be spreading all across Europe. So well done, the Italian military.
Yeah, very much so. And much like the story we had recently about a similar LibreOffice migration, it looks very much as if they're going to be being able to contribute to making the product better, and that benefits everybody, obviously, with it being open source, which is excellent news.
Yeah, the free software utopia is upon us. All the way back in the mists of time, on episode 9, long before Jesse's time, Paddy and I looked at Antergos along with Manjaro and concluded that Manjaro was excellent and that Antergos was rubbish. I actually listened to it this morning, and I know why we thought it was rubbish, but I will save that. I won't spoil it for everyone. But you, Jesse, have installed Antergos recently and thought you would give us a quick first impression of that. So please tell me it's got better.
Well, like the audience, I don't know what it was that you panned it for last time.
Well, it didn't work at all, put it that way.
Okay, it has got better, significantly better. So I know people are going to be happy about the fact we've got a first impression back, and I'll try and keep it fairly snappy. But you mentioned Manjaro, and I mean, I was looking for an easy Arch install, all right? Everyone can, jesse@linuxluddites.com, send me your hate mail about not using proper Arch. Let's just put that to one side. Could have done it, too much effort. I just wanted to install something and have all the nice, easy things working, and that's why I looked at Antergos. Now, the reason I didn't go with Manjaro is that Antergos is basically an installer for Arch, and it sets up some sensible pre-installs, whereas Manjaro has its own repos and things like this. So Antergos just uses all the Arch backend and Arch repositories and things, whereas Manjaro sort of is slightly disconnected from the Arch ecosystem. Obviously, it's all part and parcel, but it does have its own repositories, and that does come with some issues and security concerns. And so I didn't use it.
Well, you talk about security concerns, and okay, fair enough. They don't get the latest packages as quickly with Manjaro, and so there's a potential security issue there. But what you do get with Manjaro is a buffer between the bleeding edge of Arch and a usable desktop experience. You know, you have that week or two of them taking in the new Arch stuff, doing some QA on it, making sure it is actually going to work before they push it into their own repos, which you then get. So that's why I like Manjaro, because you've got that buffer there. But let's concentrate on Antergos and why, if you're too lazy to install Arch properly, it might be the way to go.
Okay, so Antergos was formerly SynArch, which was basically Arch with Cinnamon, and then they didn't like Cinnamon. There was all sorts of bits back in the day. It's now Antergos. And the website's fairly clean and nice to look at. Go in there, download the latest ISO. Obviously, it's a rolling distro, so it just gets snapshotted every now and then. And the big difference between it and Arch is that it's got an installer. Now, why in Linux we cannot come up with names that are easy to pronounce? I mean, even Antergos has got some, you need to read it twice to make sure you've got it right.
Antergos.
Yes, Antergos, yeah.
Yeah, like Ubiquity and Anaconda, terrible, really difficult to pronounce.
There are many ones that are difficult. So
okay, fair enough.
The installer they've got is written from the ground up, and it's called Knchi, CNCHI. I mean, who wrote that? Anyway.
It is quite nice though, isn't it? It looks quite like Ubiquity and acts quite like Ubiquity.
Yeah, it is a linear installer. So unlike the Fedora one you mentioned, Anaconda, which sort of has my memory of it is it's got sort of a home page, and you keep on going out to set up the disks and come back to the home page, and out to set up users and back to the home page. This one's much more linear. So anyone who's used Ubiquity will be fairly familiar with it. So as soon as you load the ISO, I put it on a USB stick, and once you connect, it won't actually install without a connection because it downloads all the latest packages. As soon as you've connected, it says now updating the installer. And the installer at boot was 0.14. And then once it updated, it's actually 0.14.6, I think. So it updated the installer before it even started, which is pretty nice.
Well, you say it's nice, but it's a bit of a fundamental flaw that you have to have an internet connection to install this thing. Because it just won't install, will it? Because, okay, I lied a little bit by saying, I wonder if it's got better. I did check this out briefly. And it's just the next button is grayed out still, like it was when I looked at it all those years ago. And so you have to connect to the network. Whereas with Ubuntu, it says it'd be better if you did connect to the internet. Whereas this just totally fails. It's like Android. You turn it on. If you haven't got a network connection, it says, nope, you're not using me. Which, okay, fair enough, you get the latest stuff, but I don't know. It would be better if you could install it offline, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm rarely in an occasion where I wouldn't have the internet while I'm installing something. So, yeah, I see what you're saying. And also on that position, it does, goes through the standard check. Do you have 8 gig of hard drive space? Does it have the internet? Is Knutschi up to date? And I was using it on a laptop and it said, yes, the laptop is plugged in when it wasn't. So I don't know quite what they were checking, but they need to brush up on that. But it is only sort of still beta software, which seems a bit odd to have your main installer as beta software, but it did the trick and it worked fine. So once you've gone through the system check, you then select your location and you get to choose your desktop. So it's got a base install, which is basically like just installing Arch. You just get a command line. Cinnamon, GNOME, KDE, Mate, OpenBox and XFCE. Now, when you select each one, it shows you a little picture of what the desktop will look like, but all it shows is sort of a very, very small sort of simplified image. And when the only difference between a desktop is where the menu bar is, it doesn't really tell you very much. It didn't really sort of show any windows or show any the start menu and things like this. So it would have been nice if they'd maybe had a bit more information to allow you to choose, because all it does is the GNOME one is a black bar at the top. The Cinnamon one is a grey bar at the top. It doesn't really tell you very much.
Yeah, I think there's an assumed level of knowledge here, isn't there? If you're getting to the point where you're going to be messing around with Arch, then you have probably used other distros before. You're not going to expect someone who's only ever used Windows or OS X to suddenly jump to Antergos, are you? So I can see why it's just like a little thumbnail. You know what XFCE is, you know what Cinnamon is, if you're looking at this.
Yeah, but then having said that, it does have a little description as to, XFCE is a lightweight and does this, is this. Cinnamon is a familiar desktop environment for people, blah, blah, blah. So it sort of does a bit of both. And I just thought if you're going to put a thumbnail there, you might as well make it more useful by showing some of the window decorations or like the application launcher or something. But once you've picked your desktop of choice, you can then select the features. So this is really why I wanted to go this way rather than a native Arch install, because it's a simple tick box affair for selecting some of the things that would require some install and setup. So these are the AUR, Bluetooth, Firefox, Flash. You can choose whether you want the long-term support kernel, LibreOffice, printing support, Steam, firewalls, things like this. So, you pick, for example, Bluetooth and LibreOffice are things that are fundamentally I need. So tick those, and there's no more faffing around or trying to make sure that you've set up and done all the sort of configuration. So that's the thing I liked, and the reason I went with Antergos. So once you've selected the features, it's a case of sorting out your partitions. I just selected erase all and carry on, and then pick your keyboard. And what I quite liked was the first time I logged in, it had remembered the wireless password and everything, so it had kept that through. I didn't have to put that back in again.
So that's new, because they didn't do that before. I remember Paddy moaning about that. I couldn't even get it working to the point where that was an issue, but Paddy had said that it didn't remember his network settings. So good that they've improved that. Yeah,
it's nice. Those little sort of touches that make things that bit easier, isn't it, for for new users or for when you just want to get on with it and not have to type in a stupidly long password all over again. So I did mention that the install software is in beta, and it does sort of say it doesn't handle RAID, ButterFS, or other advanced things that you might expect from installer. So they're yet to come, and hopefully when it comes out of beta, it'll have all those things ironed out.
So all stuff that I wouldn't use on the desktop anyway. So it's not an issue for me, but I know some people want to be using B3FS and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a dumbed down version of Arch, isn't it? What you're describing to me is a very easy to install, dumbed down version of Arch, which that's what it's supposed to be. So I wouldn't really knock it for not having advanced file systems and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's Arch for people like me.
Arch for dummies. I'm sure there's a book for that probably. So once you get it installed, then you're faced with horrendous/beautiful, depending on your point of view, Numix icons, aren't you? Specially designed for Antergos.
Yeah, exactly. So they've got a deal with the Numix guys to have all the icons. I quite like them. I think they go quite well with GNOME. It gives us sort of quite a modern kind of feel, and I would have chosen them anyway. So it's sort of taken that that hurdle out as well. I know, I'm glad Paddy's not here because he'd be having a go at me. He hates them.
He hates them, doesn't he? Yeah. Oh, so you went with GNOME then?
Yeah, it's sort of now become my desktop of choice. It seems to sort of get out of the way, and it's got little flashy bits here and there where you want them without being too annoying about it.
I'd forgotten that, I was supposed to sack you over that, wasn't I? Yeah. Oh, well.
I thought you were going to sack me for using Unity.
Yeah, that as well.
So it was not XFCE.
Yeah, why are you still here? Cinnamon, okay, that's all right. We'll stretch to that. And Mate, definitely. But they're your choices if you want to be on this show. XFCE, Cinnamon, and Mate. None of this GNOME business, honestly.
So I installed GNOME on my main PC, and I'm using it now, and we're recording on it. But I also installed the Cinnamon version on my laptop. And I have to say they've done quite a nice job of making it sort of theirs. Now, my only experience of Cinnamon has been from Mint, and obviously it's very focused on the way that Mint want it to look. And so I've not actually seen it in another sort of environment or on top of another distribution. So they seem to have done quite a nice job, but there's nothing that would really pull me away from GNOME. Now, once you're installed, it's got quite a small selection of pre-installed programs, and there's only the GNOME Music for playing music and GNOME videos. There's a picture viewer and a sort of a gedit type thing, but very little else. It does come with Chromium as standard rather than Chrome or Firefox, what have you. And after that, it's just things that you want to install.
So how was installing software on it then?
So I've heard a lot about the AUR, and people keep on saying, everything you could ever want is on the AUR, blah, blah, blah. It is a ball ache. Like, it's a real faff, because you can have it set up from the install, like I said, but I didn't, and then afterwards chose to install it. So once you've added a couple of things to a config file, it's there. But to actually install stuff from the command line, you have to do so many yes, do this, yes, do that, I agree, boom, 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 and so many sections to it. It just seems like a bit of a palaver. So they do actually have a GUI for installing, which they've stolen from Manjaro, which is Pamac, another terrible name.
Yeah, but a good piece of software though.
Yeah, a really nice GUI installer. And so it's got different tabs depending on whether you want to search or see what's pre-installed, and adding repositories and things. And then there's two separate tabs for whether or not it's come from one of the Arch repositories, which includes the main Arch repository, as well as the community, and whether it's local, I installed. But there's a second tab solely for the AUR, and you actually have to go into a setting within the package manager to select whether or not you want to install from the AUR. But like I said, I sort of avoided that. It's where you're going to have less well-checked programs, and the Arch repositories have pretty much everything I can want, so I just use the main ones.
You say it was a hassle in the command line. Can't you just have a -y flag to kind of bypass all that stuff?
You may well be able to. I didn't try that. I just sort of was surprised at how many things came up saying, are you sure about this? And you're going to have to install this as well, and it requires this dependency. It just seemed to be, given how fast Pac-Man is, and I have to say I'm really impressed with the speed of Pac-Man, it just was quite a crunching gear change to try and use the AUR. And, there are warnings and stuff on the Arch website about the quality of the packages and whether or not they're updated and maintained and things. So I just sort of felt that I'd steer clear of it and use the stuff out of the main repos. Well, the other thing that I didn't mention was when you first start it up, and now that I've been using this box for a few weeks, every time you start it up, within seconds of logging in, a pop-up will come up saying, there are 24 new updates. Do you want to install them? I mean, it is instantaneous. It's really good to see that it's the first thing that it does, and it always comes up. And I've not had any problems so far doing the various updates, so feel that my box is up to speed. And the main reason I wanted to use Arch was that we talk about quite a lot of software and new software that's been released or updated on this show, and unless you're finding a PPA or unless you can find a deb file or something, you rarely get the latest software in Ubuntu. So I just wanted to have something that was a bit more cutting edge, so that, if we say there's a new version of this come out, I'd like to be able to look at it before we talk about it. And with Arch, you're almost guaranteed to have the latest software. So that's my sort of reason for going this way.
But that's what I gave you an old laptop for. Don't do it on your production box, man. Come on.
Yeah, but feel the fresh air in your hair. Go down that route. So if I have any problems, I'm not going to come across them by using a sort of second laptop. I want to turn it on and have everything as new and shiny as it is. And then when it all goes wrong, I'll think, okay, this is why I use something more stable like Mint or Ubuntu. I just need to remind myself.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so to wrap it up then, it sounds like, given that you're running it still, it's as many thumbs up as it's possible to give.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't had any problems with it so far. It's all been up to date. It's, installing stuff is easy. I have had no real crashes or problems. As I say, while the installer is only in beta, it works absolutely fine. It's quite slick. So yeah, a big thumbs up.
Well, if I ever do decide to do Arch again, it sounds like that's the way I'll do it. On to the feedback then, and first of all, a huge thanks to Per Anderson for your PayPal donation, very much appreciated. And of course to our monthly supporters, help us keep the lights on, keep the servers running, that sort of thing. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Really is appreciated. Thanks, guys.
And contact details in this strange font that Paddy persists with. You can email us, show@linuxluddites.com, or on Twitter @linuxluddites, or if you go to the website, you'll see links to the Google Plus and Facebook communities. And of course, you can leave a comment under each show post.
And not surprisingly, we got a fair bit of feedback on our slightly underwhelming verdicts on Ubuntu 16.04. But before we delve into that, let's start with Corey Pollard, who got in touch regarding something totally different. And Corey said, I run Google Chrome as that's the only way to sync with my Chromecast, but I'd rather not use it if there were an open source Chromecast syncing solution out there. Maybe you guys or one of your listeners could recommend something.
Now, it's a shame that Jesse's not here because he's like Chromecasted up to the max, isn't he? He's got about 5 of them.
That's right, yeah.
Whereas I haven't got one because I don't own a television. Cha-ching. But I bought one for my mum ages ago and set her up with something called Get Video Stream, which is a Chrome extension, which I think is proprietary. I had a very quick look before we started recording and I couldn't see any license information for it. And that allows you to stream stuff. I hope that would work with Chromium. I don't know. So I think that's one for the audience, really. If there's any open source way to deal with the Chromecast without having to resort to Chrome, I'd like to hear about it as well because I can hopefully implement it for my mum's one.
Well, moving it on to Ubuntu then, and let's start off with some positivity. And Christopher Davis said, I don't find it underwhelming at all. This release is the first that made me change all my computers over. And Thomas McCallan, also on Google Plus, said, not underwhelming. There is much that is great about this release. It seems what happened is that several new features were implemented for the first time, and that took the dev time instead of all the edge case paper cut bug fixing and finishing touches.
Really? What new features did they add?
ZFS?
Yeah, true.
Snaps?
Yeah, okay.
New wallpaper?
Fair enough.
No, but don't you think this is really the problem? I mean, it's something we've flagged up in the past. Canonical made a big name for themselves within the FOSS community for 2 reasons, I think. Firstly, they made installation incredibly simple, and Ubiquity really changed how people installed Linux distributions. And then it was the paper cutting. It was the actual attention to detail and fixing all these little bits. And constant change has happened since then, and they've really taken their eye off that and involved themselves in just making major changes to the infrastructure as opposed to just trying to make everything work. And the constant churn has really done them no favours whatsoever.
But you talk about that constant churn. For the last however many releases, surely it has just been paper cut issues because they haven't made any massive changes, certainly not the desktop team, because all the other resources in the company have been spent on mobile and cloud.
Well, perhaps I'm being generous. I mean, my main point is that paper cutting seems to have gone by the way, and I think they're the poorer for it.
Well, we'll see when Unity 8 actually comes out and they make massive changes there, whether they can actually get the paper cut stuff sorted out and make it a nice, smooth experience. Time will tell. But Florian got in touch about ZFS and said, ZFS not worth it. Easily managed snapshots. Just imagine your mum being like, I deleted everything I need for my tax reports that you can easily send to another host. Protection from bit rot. No need for power users to resize partitions or LVM volumes. I understand if transparent compression and not needing to resync a whole array or disk when a single block in your RAID fails may only be interesting on the server and workstation side for most people. But you can get all of these features from a NAS too, where you can even access snapshots from a Windows Common Internet File System client as previous versions. All of that, I don't know. They are good features, but I don't know if they are worth the hassle. I kind of still stick with that sentiment that for the hassle of setting ZFS up on, like my mum's laptop, I just don't think it's worth it for me. Whereas I do totally understand for servers that it can be really useful. But I know you're pretty down on ZFS generally, aren't you, Paddy? Even licensing stuff aside.
I'm pretty down on the fact we have so many file systems, to be honest. Let's think about mobile for a minute. When was the last time you changed the file system on your Android phone?
I don't even know what file system it uses.
Yeah, and that's exactly how it should be. It doesn't matter. As long as the manufacturer sets it up correctly and it works, it doesn't matter. If we're talking about desktop and laptop computers, we shouldn't really care at the end of the day. And although take Florian's point about rollback and what have you, yeah, that could occasionally be a useful thing. But it's not a big enough useful thing, in my opinion, to make a whole hill of beans here. On the server side, it's a totally different story, and I can see things perfectly from his point of view there. But on the desktop side of things, on the mobile side of things, file systems, as long as they work and don't lose data, we don't care.
Well, I think that's the point, though, isn't it? This idea of losing data. You might not necessarily lose it totally, but bit rot, which I read quite an interesting article on Ars Technica about that a while back. And when you get JPEGs or whatever that have got weird artifacts in them, or an MP3 does weird skipping stuff, that's probably bit rot, which just over time, as the name suggests, the bits kind of start to go. Whereas something like ZFS can protect against that. So I can see the arguments for it, but proper backups and stuff, although actually some backup solutions will just overwrite with the bit rotten version of the file, so you end up with no original. But I think with clever backups and stuff, you can probably just about get over this stuff without resorting to ZFS. But I stand by it on the server. It seems like really good. Having heard Alan Jude talk about it at length, it seems to be very, very useful in that kind of scenario.
Yeah, and Mark also had some positive comments, but then it kind of tailed off a bit. He said, had to respond to your comments on the 1604 release. My in-place upgrade of Ubuntu Mate from 1404 to 1604 was flawless, and I'm extremely pleased with it. However, I have an Atom-powered 4 to 5-year-old netbook repurposed as a headless music server that was running Lubuntu 1404. All I really need there is Samba, Vino, and Clementine. Lubuntu was lightweight enough to keep it running quite responsively, but after 2 attempts to put Lubuntu 1604 on it, I couldn't get it to boot much beyond grub. It quietly halts during the boot and just sits there. For this purpose, I'm not interested in spending time to troubleshoot. I could have tried Arch for that. Putting 1404 back on took maybe 30 minutes and it was back to running nicely. So as far as I'm concerned, Lubuntu 1604 has turned to crap.
Why are you running a desktop on a headless machine is my first question, Mark.
That'd be mine too, to be honest.
Well, I suppose I run Ubuntu Mate on my Raspberry Pi that I mostly use headless, but occasionally it's nice to have a web browser and stuff to do the odd little thing. But I suppose that kind of just shows how difficult it is to maintain a Linux distro that's going to work on all sorts of different hardware. The beauty of OS X is that Apple knows exactly which officially supported Macs that is going to run on. And so they can do all the QA and everything and make it work flawlessly on that hardware.
Yeah, and they still get it wrong. I was reading a story this morning about freezes from the latest version on older hardware.
Oh, really? Oh. Well, yeah, I've heard that it's a bit ropey on older Macs and stuff because they want you to just throw it away and buy a new one. But it's extra difficult for a Linux distro because there's just so much varied hardware out there, isn't there? I mean, there's probably millions of different combinations of bits of hardware, motherboards and RAM and all that kind of stuff and graphics cards that it makes it almost impossible to squash all of the bugs. And so now you, Mark, have got this thing against Ubuntu 16.04, you think it's rubbish, I'm not going to use that ever again. Whereas if you'd done it on a different machine, maybe it would have been totally smooth, worked absolutely perfectly, and you would have been singing its praises. And it's just very difficult for them to do that. So I do sympathize with them that they can't test it on everything. They can only test it on the hardware that they've got and the hardware that the people who are willing to test it have got. So the only thing you can do is file a bug, give them as much information as possible, and then hopefully they'll try and fix it for you. Because just complaining to us about it isn't going to make it any better, is it? And yeah, you'll be all right on 14.04 for a little while, but if you do want to go forward, then your only options are try and get the bug fixed that made that happen. It might end up being something really tiny that they can fix easily, or roll your sleeves up and install Ubuntu server and do it all headless over SSH, like a real geek.
Well, hold that thought of real geekdom, because the last email we got was from Jason Smith, and Jason said, I haven't used Ubuntu for Windows and probably won't, as I'm now 100% Windows free. Anyway, it could end up being very useful to developers who can't or won't leave Windows. A DOS console and bat scripts just don't cut it for serious developers who are targeting Linux servers and non-Microsoft languages. The cool kids all use Bash. Microsoft is losing developers fast. Of course, the better solution would be to use Linux in the first place, but not everyone has the luxury of choice. Now, I started talking about Ubuntu on Windows last show when we were talking about Ubuntu generally, and you very rapidly squashed what I was going to say and moved on to the end of the show. So I'll take this opportunity to sort of revisit where I was going to go, and that is, I think Ubuntu on Windows is massively important, and unfortunately it's going to be massively influential in actually killing the Linux desktop.
Why is that?
Simply because I don't think an awful lot of developers are using Linux out of a commitment to FOSS ideals or anything like that. It's purely from a practical point of view that it's the only place they can do their development at the moment. And even with those developers there, the Linux desktop, and I'm talking specifically about desktops here, has stuck at around 1.5% market share for all time. I mean, it's, as long as we can remember, that's where it's been pegged, where Windows has been like 80+% all the time as well. And if you can do all that development on Windows, what incentive is there to use Linux if you aren't truly committed to the FOSS ideals? And these developers aren't. They are using it for pragmatic, practical purposes at the moment. And if everything else they're doing is on Windows, and they can now do their development on Windows, why would they be tempted to use the Linux desktop in the first place? Okay,
well, a purely pragmatic reason would be that it's never going to be as good as running on a proper Linux system. And I suppose that is the real point here. Is Ubuntu on Windows really going to be as good as a proper bare metal Ubuntu installation? If it gets to the point where it is, then you might be right. But I don't have enough faith in Microsoft to make it as good as a proper bare metal Linux installation. And I think that it'll never be quite good enough for serious developers to switch over. Maybe that's my wishful thinking, but looking at everything else that Windows does, I'm fairly confident that it's not going to be as good.
You mentioned Microsoft there. What about Canonical's involvement in this? Don't you think they have a incentive to get it working very well, and that could possibly give them an out from the whole Linux desktop space, which we know they're not particularly invested in at the moment?
Possibly, but they're still relying on Microsoft to implement their stuff, aren't they? I can't imagine it's only Canonical's engineers working on this. They've got to work with the Windows engineers, and it's also got to be working with Windows, which is a bit of a built on sand code base, isn't it? Or at least that's my understanding of it. It's not very well put together. It's kind of patched together over 20 years of bug fixes and just horribly written code. And that's why it's a bit dodgy and prone to crashing and stuff. It's not as rock solid as Linux, certainly server Linux.
I think sadly it has the opposite problem from Linux. I mean, we're talking about Mark's email a minute ago and Ubuntu and how that's changed. And in our community, we do tend to throw things away every release cycle and bring in a whole new bunch of problems because the whole code base has changed. Whereas in Windows, a lot of the code base is still there supporting the old stuff. And so you've got two opposite ends of the spectrum, each causing problems.
Well, I hope you're wrong. I really hope this doesn't tempt developers away from Linux to use Windows full time. But as I said, maybe it's just wishful thinking, and maybe you are correct here.
Well, this is one of those occasions that I hope you're right and I turn out to be wrong. Meantime, though, there's still an awful lot of exciting stuff going on in the Linux world. And let's talk about one of those projects right now.
We're now joined by Ryan Sipes, who is the co-founder, CTO, and community manager of Mycroft. So welcome, Ryan.
Hey, nice to be here.
So what is Mycroft then? I've heard a lot of publicity about it, and I don't suppose there's anyone who doesn't know, but give us a sales pitch.
Okay, so a lot of people have seen Star Trek, and they know that, like, in Star Trek, you're walking around the Starship Enterprise, and you want to do something, and you don't just walk up and, like, turn on a light with your finger or whatever. No, in the show, they're like, hey, computer, turn on the light. You know, show me whatever. And the computer does it. And that's what Mycroft is, only open source, and way more awesome.
And so this was a Kickstarter project. And can you just remind us of the timeline? So when that completed and what's been sort of the milestone since then?
So let me give you the people's history. Back in April last year, so exactly a year before now, my co-founder Josh wanted to put a artificial intelligence in his makerspace that he owns and operates. And he came to me and was like, hey, do you want to help me build this? And I was like, yeah, we can knock this out in a weekend. 1 year later, we're still developing it. After we were playing with an initial version, which was just kind of slow and buggy, but it did what we wanted it to do. We were like, hey, this could be a product. So we went to Kickstarter, and because my background is contributing to open source software, I was like, hey, you know, we should really look at making a big part of this that the software is open source, and that this device that we're making in the code inside is really a great platform for developers, makers, and hackers to be able to jump in and really push the boundaries of this voice recognition technology. And so we had a successful Kickstarter, which, considering how much planning we did for it, which was not much at all, it went very well. We raised $130,000 on Kickstarter approximately. And then we went on to raise even more on Indiegogo through their in-demand program. After that, we had money and we had to actually mass produce this thing. And so we started building a community and building a team in order to accomplish this. And we managed to attract some people to our core team from our community. So Sean Fitzgerald, he was the first technical hire in the Siri team and worked on the Amazon Echo team as well. And then Jonathan Dorlands, who's a machine learning master. And then a few other guys from my local Linux user group who just kind of got pulled in, Aaron Atchison being one of those. And yeah, it's just kind of grown from there here recently. So we've released a few different open source libraries that are kind of supporting technologies for the Mycroft platform. And this past month, we've been preparing what I call the motherload to be released, which is the Mycroft core code. A lot of people ask me why it's not out at this very moment, and that's because we have a lot of documentation that we've been doing and a lot of just bug fixes, preparing it so that when somebody apt-get install Mycroft or pacman-s Mycroft, it actually is a decent experience and inspires people to contribute back. And so we're looking at a May release of that source code, and then the floodgates will be open, and I'm just going to hold on for dear life.
Yeah.
So that's something that a lot of people have asked me about, and that isn't fully clear in a lot of people's minds what exactly Mycroft is, because on the Kickstarter there was some hardware involved that involved the Raspberry Pi, but there's also the software aspect of it. So what hardware do you need? Do you need a Raspberry Pi to run it on, or will it work on any x86 machine? I mean, where are we with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It works everywhere, with the exception of everyone's favorite operating system, Windows. But, Windows is not yet supported, but there's no reason why it couldn't be run on there. And by the way, I don't love the operating system of Microsoft, so I kind of have some disdain still.
So there's no plan to get it on Windows, really?
There are people who are looking at porting it over. At this point, it's not a big concern of mine, but I think other people on the team might be interested. And then Mac OS X, there's been some people who have allegedly got it running on there. The Unix base makes it a lot easier. And then it runs on x86 and ARM Linux as far as we've tested without any problem. You need a mic and a speaker.
Joe touched on the hardware there, and can you just explain, if it runs on a Raspberry Pi, do you need the latest one, or can it be any of the models, apart from maybe Model 0 or something? What would you say is the minimum hardware spec?
Well, we originally ran it on a Model B, just Raspberry Pi Model B. However, you can experience quite a bit of latency on that hardware. Now, the 2 is what we developed on up until like a few weeks ago when the 3 dropped. And so we ordered those. Now we're developing on the 3. It runs pretty well, like across the board. And the other day, somebody even popped it onto an Edison chip and ran it. So the answer to the question is we don't know everywhere it will run. We're trying to push down as small as possible, get it to run on the lightest weight resources that we can get to, but we're just a small team, like the core team, and so we haven't had an opportunity to test it on every single possible embedded system that's out there.
So architecturally, Ryan, people listening might be confused as to whether it's running fully locally or whether it's talking back to some servers that you're in control of. I mean, what is the architectural setup here?
So, yeah, this is like the most common question that I get. And I want to preface this because Reddit can be a mean place. Local speech to text on most machines is not up to snuff. We do a local wake word recognizer that doesn't go anywhere. So no audio goes off device until you say the keyword, so Mycroft. And then that small phrase that contains that keyword, so like what's the weather Mycroft, gets processed by a remote speech-to-text service and then pops back to the machine for handling, at which point the local machine picks it back up and takes action based on that. And then, of course, we've been managing API keys for third-party services too, but most of the processing is done locally with the exception of that speech-to-text layer.
And is it possible to run your own server for that then?
Currently, probably not, but the team is trying. We're all, been a part of the open source community for a very long time, and we understand that some people don't want their data going offsite, and they don't want, they want control over that piece. We're developing through OpenSTT, so openstt.org, a layer that can do that somebody could potentially run on location at their house or on their own droplet on DigitalOcean or whatever. But it turns out that specific piece is very, very hard. So we've been pouring a lot of resources into it. But if people want to help, they can go to openstt.org and go to our community forums and start brainstorming with us. But I think it'll be a little while before that piece gets to a point where it can be run locally.
Okay, and just to head off any questions from the audience then, and you spoke earlier about the bits you have open source and push the code out for, and you're talking about the core now. Is the core not the bit that's running on the server? What is the core that we're talking about, and what's the bit on the server we're talking about, and what's the open source position on that?
So the core is going to be released under LGPL v3, and we released it so liberally because even though, there are some downsides to that license, it also doesn't prevent people who want to embed this into a project. Maybe they're at a company and they want to voice enable it. that sometimes they have a really hard time getting those things into their product because the licenses aren't compatible with whatever they're running in their product already. And so we tried to release it under a more liberal license to allow them to be able to do that. And the core is what takes the speech to text that gets transcribed. So you say like, what time is it, Mycroft? And it sees like, hey, my keyword's there, sends it up. It goes to a much more accurate server that says, okay, this is exactly what was said. What time is it, Mycroft? Sends that back to the local, and then Mycroft then makes a decision, Mycroft core, as to what skill needs to be kicked off using the adapt intent parser that we released. And then it handles that. So it handles however it's supposed to interact with that either third-party data source, or let's say that you ask what time it is, it checks the system clock and pulls that back to you. Or if you have local media on the device, so you're like play whatever and it's local on the device, it can kick up that audio stream. It's what actually takes the action. So it kicks off what we call a skill, which is like an app on the device that does whatever it is you've asked Mycroft to do.
So it sounds like the server side of things is proprietary then. Is that what kind of what you're going around here, what you're beating around the bush to say?
I wouldn't say that. We have the intention of open sourcing all of the server side stuff that we own. Right now we use, we're kind of bumping between two speech to text services that are proprietary. One's Google speech to text and the other one's IBM's, and evaluating which one's faster and which one's higher accuracy. But like I said, the intention through our Open STT initiative is to create an open model, speech-to-text model, that's as good as these proprietary ones, so that everyone can benefit and everyone can make use of it. Because right now there is not a good open STT model that can be used by anyone. That's sad, but that's the truth of where that technology's at in regards to, these open communities.
How much of that is down to lack of training, Ryan? I mean, is it a lack of use by people and hearing different voices that's causing the problem there?
Yeah, there's a big proponent of that. If for instance, we have identified ways to train a model, but we need lots and lots more data. And we're trying to come up with strategies for getting that data from people. So for instance, maybe it's just sitting there and reading from what's on screen into a microphone. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's in order to build an open STT model, we need lots and lots and lots of data to use to train the model.
And so, speaking of voices, how did Popey end up being the voice of Mycroft?
That's the question on everyone's lips.
Is it? We were both at Scale. I heard his lovely British voice and decided that in my mind, Mycroft has a baritone British voice. And so I was like, this is perfect. Popey. Man, I was drunk. I don't know if he was drunk. I was like, you should be the voice of Mycroft. And he didn't tell me no. And so we got to where we are now. We actually got an initial version of the voice built. We finished building the initial version just today, and we're going to be doing some tweaking on it to make it sound, more and more natural. But we're hoping that we're able to produce something that's enjoyable to listen to, and it sounds natural and makes you actually want to talk to Mycroft.
So am I right in saying that he will have recorded a whole load of text, with his voice, if that makes sense, and then you'll sort of mangle that into machine sort of sounds, and they get pulled back out when you want to create the sentence? Yeah,
essentially, yeah. There's we partnered with Vocality that makes voices for custom voices for people who have disabilities and aren't able to speak, and so they brought a lot of expertise into this process, and they're kind of taking the lead on this, and we're kind of just learning from them. But yeah, you speak 3,500 phrases And then we take that and we go through a process in order to fine tune essentially what comes out. And so it is a long process. You try to get as many phrases as you can in order to emulate all the different phonemes, so to all the different sounds. And then, we go through a process of refining that. And I would recommend that anybody who is interested. So Vocal ID is a great partner, and they are doing something that's all around good for the world. There's a lot of people who, for instance, picture a girl in the 3rd grade who has, for whatever reason, isn't able to speak clearly and concisely because of a disability. She might get stuck with like a voice that sounds like a 42-year-old man, because that's what's available. And so their mission of getting people, they get people from all over the world to take the time, and you can go over there and donate your voice, and they mix 2 voices together. So they'll mix like your voice with somebody else's voice in order to create a brand new voice that's custom for whoever that person is with the disability. They're doing some really great work, so I guess this is a plug for them, and that if you have some time on your hands and a decent microphone, go over to vocalid.co and take the couple of hours to record your voice so that somebody who needs a voice can get one that's unique to them.
Back onto Mycroft. If I was to have one now, what sort of functionality does it have? And are you what is it that you're working on to fix before you release it?
So right now there's a lot of question answer functionality. We've spent a considerable amount of time working on the voice loop, which is that process of talking to it and have it talk back to you. That's critical. It has to be right. It has to be fast in order to provide a good experience. As a result, we're really hoping that here in May, when we release the source code, that the community can help us develop the skills, the skill library. So we've identified some ways to implement like Pandora and Spotify, and some ways to implement. We had Chromecast working really well until Google broke the API. So thanks, Google. So right now, most of it's question answer type stuff. What's the weather? Tell me about Abraham Lincoln, et cetera, et cetera. But there are easy ways to implement like media and a few other IoT type skills. So I've had it controlling my hue lights, but it's kind of a skill that really isn't ready for prime time. And so what we need are community members who are interested in spending time on individual skills in order to make them the best they can be. The skill that's really missing, in my opinion, is the podcasting skill. I listen to podcasts like constantly, and so it seems like it might be a difficult skill in order to manage that. So most of the problem with developing a skill is if you're already an application developer, you have to think about an entirely new form of input. So a lot of people, start developing and then they have to stop and just like spend some time thinking about like, okay, that, this person isn't seeing anything. They're just hearing, the response, and then intuitively have to say something that Mycroft will understand. And so there's actually a lot that goes into that. But it's also definitely the most natural interface a person can be a part of, because there's nothing more natural than just speaking to something and having it do what you want.
This was something I wanted to pick up with you, because speaking is a very natural way to communicate, but it's not a very natural way to do your work, if you like. If you sat in an office all day, bashing away at a keyboard, the idea of talking to your computer all day, it's a bit like Minority Report, where people are waving things around with their arms. It seems well and good until you actually try doing it for an hour or two and you get very tired arms. I mean, how do you see this actually working out within the workplace, for instance? I mean, does it have a bigger future as an input mechanism?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a paradigm shift around interacting with your computer. I don't think any of the existing ways of interacting with your computer will necessarily go away. I think that it'll just be another option. When you're working, for instance, you might want to pull up a specific document or something, and it just turns out to be that it's faster to just say it than to pop through your file manager to pull it up. One of these ways in which Mycroft is already a part of my desktop use is if I want to search for a YouTube video, we have a skill where I just say search YouTube for the Deadpool trailer. And it will just pop up the first hit on YouTube. And so that's not me consciously it is me consciously deciding to do it, but it's not something that I think about anymore. It's just like, this is the fastest way to do this. And so I don't think that you'll sit there all day just speaking to your computer, unless maybe you aren't very good at typing and you want to do up a document just by speaking and having it throw that into the document. But I do see a world in which certain tasks are just more efficient if you just say it. But especially with these devices around your house. One example that I use is in the mornings, I used to keep a Bluetooth speaker that I carried around with me into every room. And the problem is when I decided I no longer wanted to listen to a specific thing, or if I wanted to change podcasts, I would have to go and grab my phone and unlock it and go to the app and change it. Sometimes it would have been just much easier at that point to just say, hey, Mycroft, change to Linux Luddites, or whatever, rather than get out my phone and pop through the different apps in order to change the media.
Yeah, and I can see from a hardware manufacturer's point of view, if you're not having to design and build an interface into everything because you've got a unified interface somewhere else, then that's going to save on costs there as well, isn't it? Which potentially is very attractive to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it does require quite a shift in the way that people interact. I mean, you've touched on that. And I use OK Google. Oh, sorry. I'll say something else in case it triggers everyone's phone. I say the OK G word, and I will use it for setting alarms and, finding out the time and doing, oddly enough, mostly in the kitchen, like weights and measures and stuff. Because, like you say, it just pings back out you. I don't have to touch it with my dirty kitchen-y hands. It's fine. But it wasn't until I watched a video on all the things you could ask, and the fact that you could then, having asked someone's age, let's say, you could say, and in which country do they live? And it would know the next one. And without seeing a video, without sort of seeing the ways you could interact quite naturally, I wouldn't have known that they were the sorts of, that was the skills that they had, embedded into this system. And so I think it's going to take a little while for people to get used to the idea. They can say, turn the lights on, dim the lights, play this, do that. But also, because that's quite a regimented way of talking to it, do this plus that equals this kind of thing. And have you thought of any way in which you're going to sort of introduce people to the things it can do? And as time goes on, YouTube, Spotify, Google Music, whatever it might be, and these things get added in, how will people learn what the functionality is and that sort of stuff? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, so that's a challenge. There's not a lot of prior art to look at. So a lot of it's just trying things and seeing what people respond to. So we try to get this device in front of as many people as possible, but also, unlike some of the people in the same space, we have a very, very large open source community to kind of lean on for answers to these questions, or at least to help us answer these questions, because we've thought of multiple ways. For instance, like being able to ask Mycroft about new skills, or being able to or having it pop up on an app, on your phone or when you log in on your computer with like maybe even an instructional video or something. But the answer is that right now we're still learning. We're still experimenting with the different ways in which we can expose new features to users. And frankly, I'm not sure that we'll have a succinct answer until we get more and more users playing around with the technology and providing feedback.
Okay, well, we're kind of coming to the end of our time with you, Ryan, but if people want to get involved with Mycroft and help out, what's the best way for them to do that?
So right now we are actually pulling people in to help prepare the software for a much wider open release. So if you get involved in the community, community.mycroft.ai, and just ping me in there and say hello and talk about your background. We can see about getting you into the actual source code of Mycroft core. Otherwise, we have a few other initiatives that are really interesting. OpenSTT, which is what we talked about earlier in the podcast, which is, this effort in order to make speech-to-text models available for everyone and anybody's project that needs those things. That's critical in order to be able to run this stuff locally. And so if that's a big component for you, if that's something that you're really interested in, I would ask that you come and join us. And then we have Mimic, which is the text-to-speech, which will be producing Alan Pope's lovely voice, which is really under awesome active development. And finally Adapt, which is the intent parser, which helps Mycroft figure out what the heck you're saying. If any of those interest you, I would recommend that you come and join us on the community website and just let us know that you're interested, and we'll try to plug you in.
Okay, well, yeah, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And it's been really great having you on, and I hope that it goes well with the launch of it and everything. And hopefully we can get you back on in a few months and kind of catch up and see how it's developed.
Absolutely, and maybe I'll even have to get you guys a unit to play with yourselves.
Sounds excellent.
Shotgun.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, and we'll speak to you soon. Well, that was a fascinating chat with Ryan, and it seems that this whole space of AI and voice commands and stuff is getting more and more popular. So it's great to see that there is an open source project working in this space. And one thing we forgot to ask him on air, but found out subsequently, is that there are 5 full-time staff working for Mycroft and about 5 or 6 additional people and some other people helping. So it's fairly small, but I suppose it's bigger than I had originally thought. There are, a number of people working full-time on this. So I think it does have a real chance to compete with the likes of Amazon if they get things right.
Yeah, it's certainly getting to be a crowded space, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned Amazon there, and obviously the Echo's proved immensely popular and was sort of a bit of a sleeper hit for them, really. And I see Google are going to be entering the space as well.
Yeah, but it's such a new market that no one has quite dominated it yet. We don't have the same thing with the mobile phones with Android and iOS. So there is a chance, and I think we have to remain hopeful that something open source could win out. But with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. If you want to get in contact, you can email show@linuxluddites.com or find us on Twitter or at the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
See you later.